Go. Welcome to the PRCA Fuse podcast. And this is an interesting one. We're here talking about GEO, Generative Engine Optimization this week. And a couple of weeks ago, I went to an event which was the launch of a white paper called Hold the Front Page. And it's the first time I came away from an AI event in PR world. But I thought that makes absolute sense. There are no outlandish claims, just some useful research and some very practical advice for us as PR and comms professionals. And this week we're joined by the authors of that white paper, Katie Earlam from 72 Point and Stuart Bruce from Purposeful Relations. So they'll be sharing the key findings from the research and tips for the industry. So there's lots to take away from this week's podcast. Enjoy. Thank you for joining me today. Stuart, Katie, could you quickly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Of course, yes. So I'm Katie. I'm the Acting Managing Director at 72 Point. I've been leading the creative teams there now for around 4 years and working out how to improve our offerings when it comes to AI and GEO.
Perfect. Thank you.
And I'm Stuart Bruce. I'm the joint CEO of Purposeful Relations, and we are a specialist consultancy that helps PR agencies and in-house PR teams to improve performance. And primarily we do that through helping them to use AI and then helping them to use data measurement and planning more effectively.
Thank you. And we're here today to talk about AI, a particular part of AI and how it impacts the PR industry. In layman's terms, for those who don't know, can you explain what generative AI is and why it's important to us as comms professionals?
Okay, so I think it's important that it's 3 years now since ChatGPT launched, and kind of generative AI suddenly kind of jumped into kind of the front of mind for everybody. We've all been kind of inundated with the hype of what it can do. But in terms of kind of what we're talking about now, one of the big things that we're seeing happening is that more and more people are using generative AI, whether it's kind of going straight to a kind of a chatbot like ChatGPT or Copilot or Perplexity to research their answers. So instead of turning to a search engine, they're asking a full question as a prompt to an AI engine. And when we're talking about generative engine optimization, what we're thinking about is how can we as PR people influence those answers,
Right.
as opposed to kind of the old way when kind of search just simply returned the result. AI is actually creating new information each time, and it's kind of taking it from a number of sources. So we've got to start thinking, how do we start to influence what those answers are going to be? And the second part of it is we're also seeing search engines like Google giving AI overviews. So even if people aren't actively using AI, they're still seeing those AI answers, whether they want them or not.
That's interesting. And those Google AI overviews, are they informed in the same way as those ChatGPT or Perplexity, for example?
And the quick answer is yes,
Right.
because it's taking it from a multitude of sources. The more complicated answer is that every single kind of large language model out there, it's actually creating its answers in slightly different ways,
Right.
and using different sources or different weights to different parts of the sources.
Mhm.
But the thing that they've all got in, or most of them have got in common, is there's two elements to it. There's the information that is already stored in the large language model, and that's only updated at kind of set moments in time. So
Right.
some of it's going to be out of date, but then it supplements that information with web searches where it kind of adds new and fresh information to it, and the answer you see is a blend of the two.
Right, interesting. Because I guess there's a lot of confusion and there's a lot of snake oil going on with AI and what people might be able to do or how they think about how they might be able to influence the results of the stuff that you've just been talking about, Stuart. And Katie, I know that 72 Point has done a brilliant piece of research. I remember coming along to the launch of this piece of research, actually. It's really, really fascinating. Could you talk to us a little bit? Because I think the research you've done looks at trust specifically. And I think it lays a very good foundation for understanding what the opportunity is for the industry here. Could you talk us through the findings of that research?
Absolutely. So the research itself is obviously looking about trust and where people do trust in terms of their sources. Adding to Stuart's point, we see it's sort of generative AI is almost like the news editor of pulling together information, and it starts to act like a journalist. It's pulling together its own information, and we replicate that with what we do in terms of the information that we're putting out. So it's very important to understand what sources are being trusted by users, but also through AI itself. So what the report found was that experts and scientists are still the most trusted source. In
Mhm.
terms of 4 out of 5 people still trust those. Traditional media still ranks very highly, with around 55% of people still trusting traditional media. So that's your likes of the newspapers, the broadsheets, broadcast, all of that. Um, the most interesting fact I think that came out for us was the fact that 44% of people say they trust AI more than they do the government. So quite a startling fact in terms of how they think about AI and how they use it. And also that all changes in terms of your demographic. And we do see a maturity curve in terms of where people get their information from and who they trust. So obviously you have greater support for influencers when it comes to Gen Z and that audience there, but around the influences was quite low in social media in terms of that compared to the other places.
Fascinating. And so 44% trust AI over the government. That's
Yes. So
incredible.
what the other interesting part of that is the fact that we're saying sort of, how generative AI is a bit like a news editor. People are
Mm,
actually acting more like journalists themselves as well, though. They're pulling their answers, they trust them. However, they are tending to double source that information. So once they get an answer, we found that 82% of people do check that source of that information to make sure it's correct. And then around, I think are we 84% as well, sort of want to make sure that they've had real accreditation of where that information has come from.
that's fascinating. So there is this process of verification. People aren't necessarily taking the information at face value. Is that what you're
Absolutely.
saying? And
Yeah.
you talked a little bit about how where things rank in terms of sources. So media, you talked about influencers. Where did AI stand in that ranking?
So AI came under traditional media. Is that right, Stuart? I'm right in thinking that's the right
Yes.
order. Just double checking my sources, just like AI. But that's the order it came in. So quite, if we had 55%, yeah, so it came sort of above influencers, but beneath traditional media.
So it
Yeah,
was
I think it was 55 for media, 44 for AI, 38 for government, and the one that surprised me was 24% for social media influencers.
right.
Because if you actually look at kind of a lot of the stuff that the PR industry is doing, the emphasis on social media influence is probably far greater than it would, than it would be sometimes on even traditional media, and definitely more than it is on AI answers. But that's not where the public is, according to the one poll data.
Yeah. So that is really interesting, and I guess that goes to show the growing influence of AI on reputations. Um, Tell us what you found around how AI shapes reputations.
Yeah, of course. So the data that we looked at pulled together two sources. So it was obviously we had around 5,000 adults from one poll, GEO research synthesis from Purposeful Relations, and what we looked at is how that behaves like a reputation engine. So taking all of that information and looking at what was most credible and consistent. And what we found was the research showed earned media is still the most influential input when it comes to generative platforms, and with some studies suggesting 95% of citations come from unpaid editorial sources. So, what that means is we are having a huge moment for the PR industry and putting out our own content. We've become a content source. It's a fabulous source of information for AI and therefore holds huge credibility when it comes to how it's ranked. So the reputation in how it's ranking it looks at three different things. So recency, the most up-to-date verified information; relevance, niche authority over broad popularity; and reputation, so citations, verification, and credible engagement.
Interesting. And I'd love to dig into this a little bit more because our audience is PRs and comms professionals. When you're talking about earned media being powering about 95%, up to 95% of the sources for GA, are you including within that stuff like Wikipedia and Reddit? And also, I'd love to hear about how stuff like newswires are influencing these results.
Okay, so there's three things here.
Mm,
So on, as Katie said, kind of earned media is without a doubt the most influential. And out of all the reports that we looked at, the actual number varied from about 42 to 95%
right.
of citations. But even on that lowest number, it was still the biggest category. Um, and when you kind of ask about things like kind of Wikipedia and Reddit,
Mm,
this is the one of the other categories that they look at is kind of user generated content or community content or whatever phrase you want to use to describe it.
gotcha.
Um, and we can see that that is another key driver. Now, in terms of whether it's specific platforms, one of the things that our kind of research synthesis kind of warned about is being too reliant on looking at specific sites or specific platforms.
Right.
So for example, earlier in the year, some of the reports that were coming out were saying that Reddit was like incredibly influential. But then there was a report that came out about 2 weeks ago where they were saying the number of Reddit citations had fallen by 82%, whereas the citations for Medium, so another community kind of generated content site, had gone up by 54%. So I think what you can take from that is community sites matter, but don't get too hung up on specific ones because the algorithm is going to keep changing.
Yeah. Interesting. And newswires. Tell us about
Yeah,
newswires.
newswires, at the moment, they do appear to be having a resurgence. And it's important to kind of clarify that when we say newswires, that's a catch all term. There's different types of newswire. So when we're talking about newswires in this context, it's the commercial newswires that PR firms can and professionals can kind of use to put out news releases. So things like PR Newswire, Global Newswire, Business Wire, those types of services.
Right.
Um, at the moment, because the actual newswires, because they're not publishing their content directly in the same way. I don't know whether Katie, you want to kind of say a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So obviously, the newswire element is very interesting because what you find is that newspapers are becoming so reliant on them because of the lack of staff, the fact that we're finding that obviously we're seeing reporters unfortunately lose jobs because of the way everything is working in the direction of travel of the industry. They're becoming so reliant on newswires. You only have to open the Metro to find that it's actually been written either by a PA journalist or an SWNS journalist. And we have quite a unique ability at 72 Point in terms of our access to a newswire. So our sister company SWNS has a newswire which services all of the newspapers in the UK. And we have a unique sort of setup that we have a team of journalists here that write content. We have oversight from SWNS in terms of what that content looks like, and we put it out with that content on the SWNS newswire. So we find that that content gets picked up and it has an authentic sort of place in where it lands in terms of the newspapers, which is quite an advantage for being able to land original content.
Yeah, and I guess what's also interesting whenever I've looked into this and delved into the sources for one of our clients, for example, is that actually some of the sources aren't what you'd expect. You'd expect there to be the editorial sources for the large national news outlets, but actually quite small outlets, blogs or very technical trade outlets can be very influential. Is that right? Yeah. So it feels like you kind of
Absolutely.
have to take quite a broad approach in terms of your PR.
Definitely. I think what we're finding is that with the arrival of niche publications, it's no surprise sort of in this landscape that we're seeing them. People are turning to those places. We take like the London centric and Jim Waterson's work there with what he's created, that it's the authentic nature of people needing original content and wanting to see original formats, new content. It's places where we're seeing where it's starting to be a little bit more troublesome is where we see a generative people returning to using AI effectively to create that content. So having human involvement and the need for original content is emerging as a real superpower at the moment.
Mm,
And we have to replicate that in terms of how we all create our own content to make sure it mirrors what we're seeing from a publisher's point of view.
yeah,
And I think if we return to go the 3 R's that Katie mentioned earlier, that kind of recency, relevance, and reputation, I think it's especially those last two where some of the niche titles can really come in. That relevancy because they are niche. AI can recognise that it's actually an expert specialist source, and if say, I was speaking to somebody last week in that creates educational resources for schools around the world, and for them, they've got kind of top tier media, which are kind of what we'd all think of as top tier media, but
mm,
actually some of those specialist education trade media in each of the countries are going to be really important. And
yeah.
then the kind of that kind of because they have the reputation, they have the citations on those specialist topics, which is what AI can identify.
And I guess to your point about those 3 R's, relevancy, recency, reputation, does the recency part mean that it helps to have an always on approach to PR? So you're continually working to place your client in the media. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say so for sure. It's about sort of keeping up to date and relevant, and also making sure that when you're having data that kind of works as well, that's more as relevant as possible. So when you're using a data led story, for example, that having one that you've done the research last week is far going to outdo somebody that's done it, you know, 3 weeks ago. And
That's
that
right.
sort of outdated data happens quite quickly in an AI world, I would suggest, and the demographics as well and the breakdown. So having that always on, and I think also the replication of your content is also very important. So we talked about the recency, but also the repetition and the relevance of it as well. So seeing that across multiple sources and making sure that that's features in different places, and you're credited as the source as well is very, very important.
And I think it's worth thinking about kind of why relevancy is an issue. And I suspect one of the reasons is that when I kind of explained how generative AI works and the fact that you've got your large language model with a set piece of information in there, the reason it's going off and searching on the web is to see whether that's changed. So
Mm,
obviously, the most recent information is going to be the most interesting to it because that's the most likely to update the knowledge that it already has. And I think Katie's point about data was interesting as well, because I don't know whether either of you two subscribe to the newsletter by Sophie Sparrow, who's like the deputy political editor of the Express. And last week she did a great, and she every week she gives out media relations tips, and they're really really good. And last week one of her ideas was about reusing your data. So if you actually got some data from kind of 2 or 3 months ago, take another look at it and see whether you can refresh it for the Christmas period when kind of stories are light and journalists are pressed. And I think that works for AI as well. Not only is it what journalists want, AI is going to love it.
oh, good tips. Thank you. And a lot of what you're talking about here reminds me of when the SEO world, when people were talking about how to influence search results. How does GEO differ from SEO? Or are the principles broadly the same?
I think the answer is some of them are the same.
Mm,
Um, you've got, so for example, it's quite interesting if you've been involved in the SEO world, kind of back in the day when it kind of first started. Some of the techniques that we were talking about, like kind of marking it up with schema to get kind of typical, so it can, to make it easier for a machine to read.
yeah,
Some of those things are coming back. Um, but I think there's a lot more to it. And the way that I've kind of been describing it to people is it's a bit like kind of Dave Beresford with kind of the England cycling team with,
yeah,
with his marginal gains. And there are a whole host of things you need to be doing to influence AI answers. Any one of them on their own isn't going to be enough. We can identify what the most important ones are, which is the earned media one. But you've got to be doing all of those other things, some of which are quite technical. Some of which are things like giving your spokespeople more authority. If AI can kind of see a spokesperson in a news release or a news story, it might then want to see, well, actually, what does it say about the spokesperson on the website? Does it say they're an expert in that? What does it say on LinkedIn? Have they been posting stuff on social about their so-called topic of expertise? If all those things align, this looks like a credible source. If only one of them's there, it doesn't so much.
Gotcha. And that point about setting things up to make it easier for AI to read, there was a case in point where a brand website had been built on JavaScript, I believe, and AI couldn't read it, so it was missing out on the huge opportunity. Is that Levi's? I think was it
I think
Levi's?
it was Levi, yes, you're talking about, yeah.
Yeah. What about the flip side of this? So we're talking about how PR and comms can help brands and clients influence the results and make sure that it's serving accurate information about their clients. Is there a danger that AI can be misinformed? And also, I guess the flip side of that is that AI is actually making it easier to create misinformation or even disinformation as well. What can we do as comms professionals to help tackle this and maintain that trust?
I think one of the main things is that we need to ensure that we're supporting the PR industry, the PR and the media industry, to ensure that we're seeing original content and reviewing and all of that remaining in points. If you have consumer journalists, that we support them to be able to remain independent in their thought processes, and we support them with the original content that we're providing. It's also a case of looking at how we put out our own information, what we do with that human oversight. But yeah, effectively making sure that we're putting human content into to publishers, if some of them are having to use machines themselves to be able to relay that content, make it feel localized, that we ensure that that's giving them all the trustworthy information that we can. We're seeing at the moment a lot about for example, Dominic Ponsford's investigation this week about the amount of fake experts and fake voices that we've seen emerge in some of our top tier media. Well, now's a real moment for those teams that are working incredibly hard with media relations and inputting into having publicists and making sure that they're having real relationships with journalists to combat that misinformation and making sure they stand out as a real source of information. It's the fact that we are responsible for so much of this drive of content now as the PR industry, and we are somewhat reliant on, probably more than we ever have been before, means that we have a duty to be able to do that. And I think that that's something that we need to look after, is that not just the relevance, but making sure that it's absolutely watertight in its information, that these expertise can be sourced, that when we put out the information, we duplicate it on our own websites, on newsrooms, to show that we are the source of that information.
Very interesting and really, really good tips there. Very practical. Thank you for that. And so, in your view, do you think that the advent of AI has changed the nature of the relationships between journalists and PRs? I guess there's a lot of different factors at play here. The fact shrinking newsrooms that you talked about before. Is the PR industry doing enough even to support journalists?
Oh, I'm going to jump on instantly on that. I want to say no, it's not. Is the simple answer. I think the relationship changing. I mean, kind of wholeheartedly kind of endorse everything that Katie said. But I think one of the things that we need to kind of recognise is just the importance of independent media.
Right.
The importance of independent journalism, and it can't survive in a vacuum. So there's a whole debate happening at the moment in the kind of the regulatory space about kind of how much access the big tech companies should have to kind of mainstream media, to specialist media. Should it be paid for? What's the relationship between them? And I think from a PR and comms perspective, we've got to kind of think of what would be in our interests, but also what's in the interests of society and the economy.
Yeah.
And it has to be a balance. We need, AI is the direction it's going, so it needs this information. But if it's going to have this information, there's got to be a fair value exchange. The media have got to be compensated.
Yeah.
But actually, there's more to it than that. It's not just about that financial transaction, as vital as that is. there's also some of the things that Katie was talking about in terms of credibility and citation. If you speak to, the media are doing a really good job at kind of putting their case. So you've got people like Matt Rogerson, who's the head of policy at the FT. And, if you speak to Matt about this, he'll talk about how important it is that it's not just that they get paid for their content, but actually if information from the FT is being surfaced in AI answers, it's from the FT, it's a trustworthy source.
Yeah.
And I think that's absolutely critical because it goes back to our last question about misinformation and disinformation. I think one of the imperatives that we have is we as PR people have got to be influencing AI answers, and we've got to be doing it now because without a doubt there are bad actors out there who are using the same techniques as we've been talking about to do the opposite. They are deliberately trying to inject false information and their narratives into AI answers. So unless we're kind of doing it first and better, that's what's going to happen.
So what are the practical steps that we should be taking for in our strategies and our plans if when we're looking at what 2026 is going to look like for our clients or for our organizations? What are the practical steps that we can take?
I think there's a whole number of them, and both of the white papers that we've published kind of go in the kind of joint white paper. We outline kind of the 12 imperatives of things that organisations need to do, and then in the Purposeful Relations white paper, we go into some of those in a bit more detail. But the kind of the big top level ones for them is that we need to be frequently publishing news via earned media. So that's all the type of stuff that Katie was talking about. We need to be making sure that the information that we're sharing and publishing is factual. So AI is going to give far more value to that than it is to marketing speak. One of the things that we haven't kind of touched on is that there is a source that AI isn't using, which is paid media. That is not kind of, earned media and owned media are in there. So we've got to think about what that type of information that is. It's also thinking about kind of anticipating what public questions are going to be and making sure that we're there to answer them, as opposed to maybe the things that a brand wants to say, because the two things aren't always the same. And I think that's where things like, using kind of things like one poll data and research can really inform a brand. So it's not just necessarily about the story, it's actually getting under the skin of what consumers are really, really interested in. What are some of the other things? I think one of the essentials is auditing your GEO footprint. So what that means is kind of taking a snapshot of where you are now so you can actually understand what the issue you're trying to deal with is. And that's a really easy one to say, but it's an incredibly difficult one to do. And that was part of kind of our rationale for creating the white paper. There are something like 70 tools out there from different companies that claim to be able to do this. And I use the word claim because that is all they can do. With traditional SEO or media monitoring, there are established tools. You can get hold of really reliable data. You can't get hold of reliable data on what questions people are asking AI, what prompts they're using, and even just changing one or two words in a prompt, changing the country, changing the time, going to a different large language model. All of these things will affect the results that you get. So the idea that these kind of tools can give you a definitive answer when they're giving you a snapshot, it's telemetry. But that said, you've still got to understand to the best of your ability what that environment is, because then you can put in place your plan for 2026 of what you're going to be going to do about it. Because the one thing you can say for certain is that you need to be doing something.
Yeah. So it's kind of it is what you said before, isn't it? The Dales Baleford approach of marginal gains and trying to do everything everywhere all at once, but a little bit of it, And I think that previously, when there has been a bit of a debate on the impact of AI on the PR industry, some people have waited and said, "Ah, you don't need to do anything. It's actually, it's all rubbish." The stuff that you talked about there makes absolute sense. Of course, why wouldn't you do that? There are absolutely things that you can do to give yourself an edge out there next year, which I think is why I came away from your event thinking, brilliant, that's really good. Some very, very practical things there for our listeners. If they wanted to find out more about the research and about those steps, where can they go to find out more? Do you have these white papers on your website? And if so, can you share the address, please?
We've got a link on the front page of our website to both white papers. So at purposefulrelations.com. And then there's kind of two for 72 point. There's a 72.1 for the joint white paper and a one poll one. If you want to kind of see some more detail on that research that they did.
Well, is there anything else that you wanted to share with our listeners at all?
I don't think so. I think there's always one example I really like to give, which I think is quite interesting to sort of showing the narrative of why PR and why now. And I think we were approached by a motor company high street motor servicing a company who basically had decided many moons ago to ditch all PR for paid. And unfortunately, they have had zero visibility. And the personalized nature of AI means that if you search to, put in all your details and I'm looking for somebody to help fix my car, that actually what kept coming up was features from local newspapers about people that owned garages that had been running them for 30 years. So if you want an example about trust, it's the fact that Frank, who runs your local garage, he's the man that's holding all the trust. He's got all the authenticity that you need. He featured in your local paper to be able to give you some visibility, whereas you go through that paid option, it's unfortunately at the moment appears to be a road to nowhere. So a real moment for the PR industry.
Thank you.